Before we dive into the content of the episode proper, I wanted to quickly get into the nature of the episode itself. Many viewers were highly disappointed by the episode, stating it just didn't feel like a season finale. These complaints actually make quite a lot of sense, since the episode was never intended to be. When initially crafting the narrative for season 2, the writers had written out 10 full episodes. However, just as the shooting was set to begin, HBO corporate demanded they cut the season down to just 8 episodes. This would have been an unenviable task already, but this became even more difficult as the writer's strike began around the same time. In turn, rather than be able to conduct substantive rewrites and modifications to the season's pacing, the House of the Dragon team was essentially forced to work with what they already had, by inorganically cutting off what would have been 2 whole additional episodes from the end of the season. In turn, I myself will be keeping that frustrating context in mind when assessing this episode, and I would encourage you all to do the same. In my opinion, given this context, the episode we did get was the best possible we could have gotten. If the season hadn't been arbitrarily shortened, I guarantee you audiences would have lauded this episode as a fantastic mid-season addition. Even in its new framing as a finale, I would argue it still was an incredibly strong piece, and the last-minute work that the team did, particularly around the creation of a final montage, really helped it still manage to work as a finale. With that key context out of the way, let's dive into the content of the episode proper. There's quite a bit to discuss here, so as always, if there's anything you think I missed or would like me to expand on further, feel free to let me know in the comments section below. The episode begins with Tyland Lannister having arrived on the eastern continent of Essos. He finds himself in the city-state of Tyrosh, where he's meeting with the leadership of the Triarchy forces. If you recall, in the backdrop of the majority of Season 1, Westeros was in an unofficial war of sorts with this alliance of Essosi city-states. They were fighting over control of the Steppe Zones, a series of islands scattered between the Westerosi and Essosi continents. In last week's episode, we saw Aemond order Tyland to treat with this former enemy in order to gain their help in breaking the Black faction blockade. After some hesitancy, representatives from the Triarchy agree to work with the Green faction, but only in exchange for the Stepstones. After some persuasion, Tyland reluctantly agrees. This essentially means that the past decades of war were in vain, as the territory Westerosi forces fought so hard to keep control of was simply handed over to solve a current issue. Still, even with this deal, Triarchy aid isn't yet a guarantee. Tyland will first have to impress and win over the leader of their fleet, Shariko Lohar. Lohar seems to have taken on the role that the Crab Feeder held in Season 1. If I recall, Lohar only had about a page dedicated to them in the book, so it was great to see how the show expanded their role, setting them up to be a more present recurring character. The show has done these character expansions super well so far with characters like Simon Strong and Sylvie, so I look forward to seeing more of Lohar next season. This plot thread of Tyland having to win over Lohar quickly exploded into a myriad of memes on social media, partially because Lohar was actually played by fellow YouTuber PhilosophyTube. I've never seen her content myself, but it's still always nice to see YouTubers rising to such heights. I wanted to quickly address the gender situation surrounding this character, as it has created quite a lot of controversy and discourse amongst the fandom. In the show itself, as well as in the book, Lohar is referred to as a he by others. However, we never see how Lohar refers to themselves. The actress who plays them, Abigail Thorne, is a trans woman and is always referred to a character using she/her pronouns. In my personal opinion, I think that the gender ambiguity behind this character is intentional by the writers, and in turn, I will use they/them pronouns to describe the character unless we get further clarity. Meanwhile, back with the main core of the Green faction over in King's Landing, things are absolutely falling apart, even more so than they already have been. Aemond, infuriated by his humiliation in the face of Rhaenyra's new dragon riders, has been flying to different villages across the Crown Lands, destroying them with no logic or mercy. He even tries to enlist Helaena to join him in this destructive warpath, but she adamantly refuses. Her rejection of Aemond is supported by Alicent, who has had enough with her son, but we'll get back to her in just a bit. Larys, seeing Aemond's further slip into villainy, knows he and Aegon are done for if they stick around any longer. After all, either Aemond's going to finish what he started and kill Aegon off, or Rhaenyra will do so when she arrives to take the castle with her new dragon riders at her side. As Larys lays out, it's essentially stay and die or flee and live. As we find out in the closing montage, Larys successfully convinces Aegon to abscond with him to the city-state of Braavos over in Essos. If you recall from Game of Thrones, Braavos is the home of the Iron Bank, as well as the headquarters of the Cult of the Faceless Men, whom Arya trained with. We learned earlier in the season from Simon Strong that Larys had transferred all of the Strong family's wealth from Harrenhal to King's Landing. However, we now learn that Larys transferred it further on to the Iron Bank of Braavos, possibly foreseeing a situation of this nature. Larys and Aegon aren't the only members of the Green faction looking to flee in the face of Aemond's rising villainy and the Black faction's rising strength. After Aemond assaults Helaena when trying to force her to ride to war with him, Alicent firmly realizes that enough is enough. She meets with Grand Maester Orwyle, seemingly her only remaining ally, to arrange secret passage out of King's Landing. Where she goes, we'll discuss toward the end of this breakdown. At this point, it seems that the show has firmly crushed the Helaeman ship. You see, there's been a popular theory amongst readers that, in the book, Aemond and Helaena had a secret affair behind Aegon's back, and that perhaps some of her children were in fact Aemond's. However, it seems that the show is firmly squashing this theory by making Aemond increasingly more brutal, particularly toward Helaena, their characters simply not being compatible in this iteration. We'll get back to Helaena and her conversations with Aemond in just a bit, but for now let's move over to the Black faction. Very briefly, we get a few glimpses throughout the episode episode of Rhaena being lost in the mountains of the Vale, still desperately searching for the dragon that she hopes to finally claim as her own. She's clearly been out there for a while at this point, as she's shown to be severely dehydrated and covered in dirt. Over on Driftmark, her grandfather Corlys has finished the reconstruction of his main ship, which he plans on using to join the blockade of King's Landing himself. Formerly called the Sea Snake after his own nickname, he has renamed the ship to the Queen Who Never Was, the nickname of Rhaenys. He tells Rhaenyra that everything he does for this cause, he is really doing for Rhaenys. Before setting out, however, we later see Corlys encounter his bastard son Alan, giving us one of the best scenes in the episode. After holding in his feelings in favor of stern emotionlessness all season, Alan finally lets it all come pouring out. His resentment toward his father for abandoning him, the struggles he went through essentially taking care of his brother all on his own, living in poverty while Corlys and his proper family lived richly. He accurately calls Corlys out for only now trying to form a connection with him after the rest of his family has passed. Though Alan is honorable and will continue to serve Corlys as a leader in the Black Faction Armada, he refuses to have any actual relationship with him. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra's much less loyal advisor, Alfred Broom, has finally arrived at Harrenhal, where Daemon has finished gathering his newly assembled Riverlands army. Alfred pulls Daemon aside and blatantly expresses that he'd rather Daemon lead than Rhaenyra, further tempting Daemon into using his forces to make his own claim to the throne. Though we know of Daemon's vision-induced character development across this season, Alfred obviously has no way of knowing so. During their conversation, if you listen closely, you can actually hear a whisper of the word traitor coming from the weirwood tree they are speaking in front of, but we'll get back to that weirwood in just a minute. Eavesdropping on this private treasonous conversation is Simon Strong, who has had about enough of Daemon's flirting with betrayal. He contacts Rhaenyra directly, urging her to come to Harrenhal herself to stop Daemon. Over on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra is hosting a feast of sorts for her new dragon riders. Though Adam and Hugh are clearly respectful and subservient to her, Ulf has absolutely no manners and behaves like an absolute asshole at the table. Ulf's behavior there and earlier in the episode infuriates Jace, further fueling his worries and prejudices that he conveyed last episode. Still, despite the uneasiness of the feast thanks to Ulf, Rhaenyra presents her plan to send Adam, Ulf, and Hugh to attack Old Town and Lannisport. Old Town being the hub of House Hightower and Lannisport being the hub of House Lannister, attacking the two most loyal Green Faction cities would send an immensely strong message. When confronted about the amount of innocent smallfolk who would die in those attacks, both Rhaenyra and Jace affirm that this is a sacrifice that they're willing to make. Both this and Rhaenyra's lack of care toward those vying to become one of her dragon riders in the last episode are hinting at a dangerous path Rhaenyra seems to be treading. I wonder how this lack of regard for the common folk will go over with Mysaria. After all, the core of Mysaria's motives seem to be in the interest of the well-being of the small folk. The feast is interrupted by the arrival of Simon Strong's letter, prompting Rhaenyra to immediately leave for Harrenhal. Rather than take Jace, however, she chooses Adam to accompany her. Though logically it makes no sense for both the Queen and her heir to embark on a potentially dangerous mission together, we can clearly still see anger all over Jace's face based on her choice regardless. Despite the clear logic behind her choosing of Adam, Jace is most definitely getting sick and tired of being snubbed. Daemon, having no idea Rhaenyra will be arriving on his doorstep in the morning, tries to get one last night of sleep in the cursed castle. We know how well that goes at Harrenhal, however. He is awoken by Alice Rivers sitting at the edge of his bed. Whether they had slept together or she had just shown up in his room is unclear. Regardless, she encourages him to join her in visiting the weirwood tree, a request that he reluctantly obliges. When walking down toward the tree, we quickly see some sort of humanoid creature scurry behind it. Fellow book readers and I have theorized that this is most likely one of the Green Men. The Order of the Green Men is a cult that lives on the Isle of Faces, an island at the center of the God's Eye, the lake right next to Harrenhal. This island is filled to the brim with weirwoods, trees that this order exists to protect. Since there is a magical aura of sorts around the island, most normal individuals aren't able to sail there without being thrown off course. In turn, most people have never seen the Green Men for themselves. However, there are rumors as to whether the Green Men are even fully human at all. Though the Maesters believe them to just be normal human men who wear green outfits and horn helmets, this episode shows us that the alternate theory, that they are most likely some sort of human children of the forest hybrid, is much more likely to be accurate. Daemon, no longer in denial of the potent magic at play here at the castle, obliges Alice's request that he places his hand on the weirwood. Weirwood paste as red as blood oozes from the tree's eyes and mouth, engulfing Daemon's hand. And thus, we are thrown into what is, in my opinion, the heart of this episode, Daemon's vision sequence. First, we see a Targaryen-looking man with a dark purple birthmark on his face sitting in a bundle of weirwood tree roots. This is a young version of Brynden Rivers, otherwise known as Bloodraven. If you recall from Game of Thrones, this was a man that held the title of Three-Eyed Raven before Bran. The bundle of roots he is sitting in is in the heart of the weirwood cave where Bran would find him in the main series. Bloodraven then transforms into a literal Three-Eyed Raven, further conveying the nature of his identity. We then transition into the perspective of a running direwolf, likely Jon Snow's POV while being warged inside of his direwolf ghost. The wolf is stopped in its tracks when it encounters an army of White Walkers. We are then shown the dead corpses of all of the dragons surrounding Daemon before he falls into a pool of water. We then see a bundle of dragon eggs on fire and a red comet in the sky. If you recall from Game of Thrones, this comet was in the sky when what we see next happened. We are then shown Daenerys, alone in the SOC desert, having just hatched her 3 dragon eggs. Daemon then finds himself in the Red Keep throne room, and sitting on the Iron Throne is Rhaenyra. He turns to find Helaena, who seems to have tapped into his vision. She basically tells him that now he understands the part he has to play in this broader story. Before we get specifically into Helena's presence in this vision, I want to provide my holistic understanding of what this vision sequence was trying to convey without giving any book spoilers. In somewhat abstract forms, we are shown the Three-Eyed Raven, Jon Snow, and Daenerys, the three most important figures in the fight against the White Walkers. Through the field of dead dragons, we are shown that all of the dragons will die out, which isn't a spoiler since we know that at the start of Game of Thrones there hasn't been any dragons around in roughly 200 years. However, we see Daenerys hatching her dragons, bringing the creatures back into the world to counteract the White Walker threat. The vision concluding with Rhaenyra on the throne ties it all together. Blood-Raven, Jon Snow, Daenerys, in order for these three pillars, these three heads of the dragon if you will, to exist and fulfill their roles in the future, Rhaenyra needs to win the Iron Throne now. Essentially, the role Helaena affirms Daemon has to play is supporting Rhaenyra in her taking of the throne now, so that these key figures will be around to face the White Walker threat in the future. It's very intriguing to me that Helaena was able to enter Daemon's vision. To clarify, her presence wasn't just a mere part of the vision, since we see her directly engaging with it in real time when it cuts back to her in King's Landing. I always interpreted Helena's abilities to fall under the magical category of dragon dreams. This is a type of magic that sometimes emerges in the Targaryen bloodline, giving them prophetic visions of the future in the form of their dreams. However, we now see that she is able to directly interject herself into visions stemming from weirwood magic, something I only thought possible amongst Greenseers. Though many are claiming this to be a plot hole, or more specifically, a failure from the showrunners to understand the breadth of George R. R. Martin's established magic system, I have to disagree. George's magic system has always intentionally been left incredibly vague and abstract, always leaving room for a breadth of theorization and speculation. There has always been discourse amongst fans around the idea that maybe there was some sort of central magical source in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe. Dragon Dreams, Green Sight, Lord of Light Resurrection, these may all just be different methods or lenses through which individuals can tap into this singular central source. All's to say, Helena's magical abilities being shown to us in these different seemingly contradictory forms may not be contradictory at all, but more of a showcase as to how much more powerful and in tune with her abilities she has grown. Helena's direct interjection into Daemon's vision was interrupted by the arrival of Aemond. Though with a more calm demeanor, he does apologize for his physical violence and rage toward her earlier, he doesn't back away from his stance that she should ride alongside him to war. She once again adamantly refuses to go with him, not only because she doesn't want to harm innocents, but because she saw what he did. Her abilities allowed her to see that he had tried to kill Aegon. They've also shown her that Aemond will die at the God's Eye, the lake right next to Harrenhal, and that Aegon will sit the throne again. Two foresights that she isn't afraid to share with Aemond. When Aemond threatens to have her killed in response, Helaena affirms that this future is set in stone, and that her death would not change this course of events. This causes Aemond to storm off, tears bubbling in his eyes and a concoction of fear and rage emanating from his expression. Upon Rhaenyra's arrival at Harrenhal in the morning, she is faced with an army who seems more loyal to Daemon. They don't bow in her presence, showing that they aren't sure whether they serve her or Daemon directly. This is, in my opinion, an actual plot hole, since Oscar Tully stated last episode that the Riverlord's loyalties were to Rhaenyra, and that they hated Daemon, but only worked with him as a reluctant means of serving her. In turn, they logically should be bowing upon her arrival, and definitely shouldn't be unsure as to where their loyalties lie. Regardless, Daemon comes to the front of the crowd and bends the knee to Rhaenyra in front of all, causing them to follow suit. If his myriad of visions throughout the season weren't enough to solidify his loyalty, this final vision sequence clearly sealed the deal. Still, however, Rhaenyra doesn't allow him to get off scot-free. In High Valyrian, she essentially tells him that if he ever strays away from her again, she will kill him. In the roaring supportive crowd, we see Alfred Broom sneak away. With his plans to persuade Daemon to make claim to the throne having failed, he obviously knows he can't go back to Rhaenyra's council as a clear traitor. Leaving a now confirmed to be loyal Daemon at Harrenhal to lead the Riverlands army, Rhaenyra returns to Dragonstone to prepare for her upcoming attacks, bringing us to the climax of the episode. Her sleep that night is interrupted by a member of her Queensguard, informing her of the arrival of a visitor at the castle. She comes downstairs to find Alicent waiting. In a clever parallel to Rhaenyra sneaking into King's Landing to meet Alicent early in the season, Alicent now stuck into Dragonstone to meet her. A lot of book readers have taken major issue with this scene, it being yet another meeting between Alicent and Rhaenyra that wasn't in the book. However, I personally don't hold that same sentiment anymore. This sequence, and more broadly, this episode as a whole, really changed my perspective on House of the Dragon as an adaptation. I'm coming to understand the show as more of a remix of Fire and Blood rather than a straight-up adaptation, and I don't think I mind that. We're seeing character development, hypothetical events, and dives into magic that a book told from the perspective of maesters trying to chronicle the war simply couldn't provide. Essentially, I now see House of the Dragon as its own narrative, using the template of the book to tell a more character-driven story. Anyway, we see that Alicent has snapped. Fully realizing that her sons are monsters, all she now cares about is the safety and freedom of herself and her daughter Helaena. In this position of desperation, she has finally abandoned the cause and lifestyle that she's been trapped within all of her life. Thus, in exchange for her and Helena's freedom, she proposes a deal to Rhaenyra. With Aemond about to depart toward Harrenhal on his dragon Vhagar, and Aegon too broken to do any sort of ruling, and Alicent not being a part of the small council any longer, the de facto decision maker left in King's Landing would be Helaena. Alicent promises that if Rhaenyra were to take King's Landing while Aemon was away, she and Helaena would essentially hand everything over to her willingly and peacefully. In exchange, Rhaenyra would have to let her and Helaena go free. However, Rhaenyra needs one more condition from Alicent in order to agree to the deal. She insists that she needs Alicent's permission to publicly execute Aegon for all to see in order to cement her rule. Oddly, Rhaenyra frames this part of the deal as being a son for a son. This doesn't really make sense from a writing perspective, as though Aemon murdered her son Lucerys, the Black faction already technically killed Aegon's son Jaehaerys in response. This is just a nitpick, however. After a long pause filled with hesitance and emotional turmoil, Alicent agrees to Rhaenyra's terms, and the deal is set. Alicent is willing to trade the life of her son in exchange for her and her daughter's freedom. In one last desperate plea, Alicent tries to persuade Rhaenyra to run away with her, abandon all of this and start a new life. Rhaenyra, of course, rejects this plea. Her responsibility is taking the throne, whether she wants it or not no longer matters. And thus, we transition into an incredible closing montage, showcasing where all our key characters are as we exit Season 2 and prepare to enter Season 3. Ulf, Hugh, and Adam are all suiting up for Dragon Battle. Whether they will be heading to Old Town and Lannisport as planned, or joining Rhaenyra in her taking of King's Landing remains to be seen. Rhaenyra's wandering through the mountains of the Vale finally bears fruit, as she comes face to face with the wild dragon she's been searching for. The Lannister and Hightower armies march toward the Riverlands to fight for the Green faction. Flying overhead of the Hightower forces is a dragon. Though we can't see its rider, all context points to it being Daemon, who should finally be entering the show next season. As a reminder, he's Alicent's youngest child who hasn't yet been shown on screen, only referred to in conversation throughout the season. We see the Stark army crossing from the north into the Riverlands through the Twins. Thanks to Jace's deal with House Frey a few episodes back, the Starks were able to use this bridge crossing, and in turn, should be able to catch up to the Green faction forces fairly quickly. In the Riverlands proper, Daemon is getting ready to lead his army out to battle. Whether this is to face the incoming Lannister and Hightower armies, or to support Rhaenyra's taking of King's Landing, we do not yet know. Tyland Lannister and Shariko Lohar's alliance has been cemented, as we see the two leading the Triarchy fleet toward battle with the Black faction blockade, sailing together to fight for the Black faction in this looming sea battle are Corlys and Alyn. We finally see Otto, who has been MIA since his departure from King's Landing early in the season. If you recall, he was reported to have never made it to his planned destinations of Highgarden or Old Town, and he wasn't returning any of Alicent's letters. We now see that he's been trapped in some sort of dark cell for some time, as is indicated by the dirt covering him and is squinting at the approaching torchlight. Though we don't yet know where he is or who has captured him, I have two theories. To clarify, none of these guesses are book spoilers, as in the book he was still in King's Landing at this point in time. My first potential guess is that he could have been captured by House Beesbury. If you recall, throughout the season there have been multiple small council conversations about them. Though they are supposed to be a vassal house of the Hightowers, they have staged a rebellion against them in support of Rhaenyra. This is because back in Season 1, Kristen murdered the head of their house, Lyman Beesbury, for speaking in Rhaenyra's defense at the Green Council. Capturing Otto, the leader of House Hightower, would be the perfect advantage for the rebellion. My second guess, and the one I think may be more likely, is that Otto has been captured by Mysaria. After all, if you remember back in Season 1, she had kidnapped Aegon in the wake of Viserys' death. She made a deal with Otto that, if she returned Aegon, allowing him to ascend the throne, then Otto would have to shut down all of the child fighting rings in King's Landing. His failure to do so, coupled with all the other harm the Green faction has done to the small folk, as well as Larys' burning of her establishment, is what drove her to Rhaenyra's side in the first place. Perhaps Mysaria is secretly taking revenge on Otto right under Rhaenyra's nose. Speaking of Aegon, we see that he has heeded Larys' pleas, and together, the two are sneaking away from King's Landing in a flimsy cart. I can foresee this absconding causing major issues for Alicent. After all, Alicent promised Rhaenyra that she could execute him when she takes King's Landing. If Rhaenyra would arrive at King's Landing to find Aegon gone, she would believe Alicent reneged on her end of the deal. And why then would Rhaenyra honor her end of the deal by letting Alicent and Helaena go free? The final shots we get of this montage and the episode and the season as a whole are powerfully symbolic. We see Alicent standing on a cliffside, the open ocean in front of her. This symbolizes that, for the first time in her life, she is free from the burdens that have been trapping her. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Rhaenyra, who is surrounded by the endless shelves of scrolls in the Dragonstone library. In other words, she is surrounded by the history of her family, symbolizing that she is trapped in the Targaryen expectation of legacy and rule. She has no choice but to take King's Landing, no choice but to execute Aegon. While Alicent has finally escaped the shackles of her queenhood, Rhaenyra is left more trapped by them than ever. And thus, that imagery concludes Season 2 of House of the Dragon. This season has been met by a large amount of criticism, some of which I agree with and wholeheartedly admit is deserved. Still, despite its issues, I overall see this season as yet another masterpiece like the first. Despite some plot holes and unfortunate writing mishaps, we have been treated to some of the best acting, cinematography, and character writing I've ever seen. I am so immensely grateful to Ryan Condal and the rest of the team behind this show for taking the genius of the work of my favorite author, George R. R. Martin, and translating it with such love and care to the screen. Though I can't wait for Season 3, which will likely release in 2026, we will luckily be returning to this incredible world a whole lot sooner. Next year, we're actually getting another prequel show, titled A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. This series will take place right smack in the middle of the time between House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, set roughly 90 years before the original series. Based on a series of novellas by George R. R. Martin, the show will follow Sir Duncan the Tall, ancestor to Brienne from Game of Thrones. We'll see his rise from a poor peasant knight for hire to Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. I can't wait to cover that show in just as much depth as I have House of the Dragon. In the meantime, however, I hope to bring you more videos diving into different topics and personal points of interest from House of the Dragon and the main A Song of Ice and Fire book series. If you have any ideas for topics you'd like me to cover, be sure to let me know in the comment section below. Your comment might just be turned into a whole video. If you enjoyed my videos this season and would like to see my future coverage of House of the Dragon, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and the A Song of Ice and Fire saga as a whole, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I've had so much fun journeying through this season with you all, and I thank you so much for watching.